The waiter didn't even bother handing over a menu. Instead, he looked at the man standing near the entrance, frowned slightly, and said something that instantly made the nearby tables go quiet. "Sir, this restaurant is for guests with reservations." The man paused. He wasn't dressed like the usual customers who filled the luxurious dining room. No expensive suit, no flashy watch. Just simple jeans, a dark jacket, and a calm expression. That man was Steven Seagal, but the waiter didn't recognize him. Around them, the restaurant glowed with warm lights from crystal chandeliers. Soft piano music floated through the air, while wealthy guests laughed over glasses of wine and beautifully plated meals. It was the kind of place where appearances mattered. And right now, the waiter had already made up his mind. "I'm just here for dinner," Steven said calmly. The waiter crossed his arms and shook his head. "Look, sir, we're fully booked tonight." Steven slowly glanced around the room. Several tables were clearly empty. Still, he didn't argue. He simply asked, "So you won't serve me?" The waiter leaned a little closer and lowered his voice. "To be honest, people usually come here dressed a little more appropriately." A couple at a nearby table chuckled quietly. Someone whispered, "Did he really just say that?" But Steven didn't react with anger. Instead, he gave a small nod, as if he had heard things like this before. "All right," he said quietly. Then he turned and walked toward the door. No argument, no raised voice, just calm silence. The waiter watched him leave, feeling strangely proud of himself for protecting the restaurant's standards. But what he didn't know was that the quiet man he had just turned away wasn't an ordinary customer. And in just 15 minutes, the restaurant would experience something none of the staff or the guests would ever forget. Because when the doors opened again, everything was about to change. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe people should never judge someone by their appearance, type respect below. Friday nights at the restaurant were always intense. The place was called the Golden Crown, one of the most exclusive dining spots in the city. People came there to celebrate promotions, close million-dollar deals, or simply enjoy the feeling of being somewhere luxurious. Crystal chandeliers glowed above the dining room, soft piano music floated through the air, while waiters in spotless uniforms moved quickly between tables, carrying silver trays filled with gourmet dishes. Every detail in the restaurant was designed to impress. But behind the elegance, the staff lived under constant pressure. The manager, Mr. Collins, had one rule that he repeated every single day. Appearance matters. Our guests expect a certain level of class. To him, that didn't only mean the restaurant decor or the food, it meant the customers too. If someone walked in wearing an expensive suit or designer dress, the staff greeted them like royalty. But if someone looked ordinary, the welcome wasn't always so warm. Among the waiters working that night was a young man named Daniel. Daniel had only been working at the Golden Crown for 3 months. He was ambitious, eager to prove himself, and desperate to impress the manager. Tips were good, but promotions were even better. And Daniel believed following the manager's rules would help him move up quickly. That night, the restaurant was almost full. Couples filled the window tables. A group of businessmen laughed loudly near the bar. In the corner, a family celebrated a birthday while a waiter brought out a cake surrounded by sparklers. Everything looked perfect. Then the door opened. Daniel glanced toward the entrance. A man had just walked in alone. Simple jeans, dark jacket, calm face. No expensive watch, no designer clothes, no sign that he belonged in a place like this. The man slowly looked around the restaurant as if deciding where to sit. That man was Steven Seagal. But Daniel had no idea who he was. To Daniel, he was just another person who didn't fit the image of the restaurant. Before the man could walk toward a table, Daniel hurried over. "Good evening, sir."
Steven nodded politely. "Evening. Do you have a reservation?" Steven shook his head. "No, but I only need a table for one." Daniel hesitated. The truth was there were still a few empty tables available. The restaurant wasn't completely full yet, but Daniel remembered the manager's voice in his head. "We serve elite customers here." Daniel forced a polite smile. "I'm sorry, sir. Tonight is reservation only." Steven glanced around again. A nearby waiter noticed the situation and whispered quietly as he passed Daniel, "There's a free table near the window. Just seat him." But Daniel ignored the suggestion. He wanted to follow the rules exactly the way the manager expected. Sometimes ambition makes people forget something important: basic respect. Steven looked back at Daniel calmly. "Are you sure there's no table available?" Daniel crossed his hands in front of him. "Positive." Steven studied his face for a moment, as if trying to understand whether the answer was truly about reservations or something else. Then Daniel added one sentence that changed everything. "To be honest, sir, this place might not be what you were looking for." The words were polite on the surface, but the meaning behind them was clear. A couple sitting nearby overheard the comment and exchanged uncomfortable looks. The older waitress near the bar frowned slightly. Something about the situation didn't feel right. But Daniel didn't notice. He believed he had just done the right thing. What he didn't realize was that the quiet man standing in front of him was someone the entire world recognized. And in just a few minutes, the entire restaurant would realize it too.
But before we continue, have you ever seen someone judged unfairly because of their appearance? Tell me in the comments, and don't forget to type respect if you believe kindness should come first. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the restaurant continued around them, glasses clinking, quiet laughter, the soft sound of piano music in the background. But near the entrance, the atmosphere had become strangely tense. Steven Seagal stood calmly, looking at Daniel. Daniel kept his polite smile, but inside he felt slightly annoyed. In his mind, he had already explained the situation. No reservation, no table. It was that simple. Steven finally spoke. "So you won't serve me tonight?" Daniel shook his head. "I'm afraid not, sir." Daniel glanced once more at the dining room. There were still empty tables. A couple near the window had just paid their bill and were preparing to leave. Another table in the corner had been empty for nearly 20 minutes. Yet Daniel stood firm. Behind the bar, the older waitress who had noticed Steven earlier watched the conversation carefully. Something about the man felt familiar to her, but she couldn't quite place it. Meanwhile, a businessman sitting nearby leaned toward his friend and whispered with a small grin, "This should be interesting." Steven looked back at Daniel. His voice stayed calm. "I only wanted a quiet dinner." Daniel sighed slightly. He was starting to feel that the conversation had gone on long enough. Lowering his voice, he leaned closer. "Look, sir, I'll be honest with you. Our customers usually come here dressed a little more formally." The message was clear. A few people at nearby tables overheard the comment and exchanged awkward glances. One woman shook her head quietly. But Daniel didn't notice the uncomfortable reactions. In his mind, he was protecting the restaurant's reputation. Steven remained silent for a moment. Then he gave a small nod. "I understand." Daniel felt relieved. Finally, the situation seemed to be ending. Steven turned toward the door and began walking out of the restaurant. No anger, no complaint, no argument, just quiet acceptance. As he reached the door, the older waitress stepped slightly forward, almost as if she wanted to say something, but Steven had already walked outside. The glass doors closed behind him. Daniel watched for a second, then shrugged. "Well," he muttered under his breath, "problem solved." The businessman who had been watching the scene chuckled softly. "Cold move," he said. Daniel simply smiled and adjusted his uniform. To him, the situation was finished. Another waiter walked past and asked quietly, "Are you sure that was the right call?" Daniel confidently nodded. If he was someone important, he wouldn't show up dressed like that. The older waitress still looked uneasy. "I don't know," she murmured. "His face looked familiar."
Daniel laughed lightly. "Trust me, I would know." But sometimes the biggest mistakes are made when people feel the most confident. Outside the restaurant, Steven Seagal stood on the sidewalk for a moment. He glanced back at the glowing windows of the restaurant. Then he took out his phone. A short, quiet call. Just a few words. "Yeah, I'm here." He listened for a moment. "Give me about 15 minutes. Then he ended the call and calmly waited. Inside the restaurant, everything returned to normal. Waiters served dishes, guests laughed and continued their conversations. Daniel walked back to his section feeling satisfied that he had done his job well. But exactly 15 minutes later, the peaceful evening inside the Golden Crown was about to turn into something no one in that room would ever forget. Because when the restaurant doors opened again, the man Daniel had just turned away would not be alone.
15 minutes passed quietly inside the Golden Crown. The restaurant had returned to its usual rhythm. Waiters moved between tables carrying plates of steak and seafood. The pianist in the corner continued playing soft jazz while guests talked and laughed over glasses of wine. Daniel had already forgotten about the man he had turned away. To him, it was just another small moment during a busy shift. "Table 7 needs the bill," the manager called from across the room. Daniel nodded and walked toward the table with a confident smile. In his mind, the evening was going perfectly. But then something outside caught the attention of several guests sitting near the windows. Headlights flashed across the dining room walls. A long black car slowly pulled up in front of the restaurant. One customer looked outside curiously. "Looks like someone important just arrived." A second car stopped behind the first, then a third. The quiet restaurant began filling with whispers. "Is that a celebrity? Maybe a politician, or a business executive?" The manager immediately straightened his tie and adjusted his jacket. VIP guests were always good for the restaurant's reputation. "Daniel," he said quietly, "go open the door." Daniel walked toward the entrance, trying to look professional. As he reached the glass doors outside, the first car door opened. Several well-dressed individuals stepped out. Men in tailored suits, a woman carrying a folder, another man speaking into a phone. Daniel's confidence faded slightly. These people clearly looked important. He pulled the door open, and the first person who stepped inside made his heart drop. It was the same man he had refused to serve earlier, Steven Seagal. But this time he wasn't alone. Behind him walked 3 executives and a sharply dressed assistant carrying documents. Another man followed them holding a tablet and speaking quickly. The entire restaurant began to notice. Forks paused in midair. Conversations stopped. Someone near the back whispered loudly, "Wait, isn't that Steven Seagal?" Phones slowly appeared as guests tried to take discreet photos. Daniel stood frozen at the entrance. For the first time that night, he didn't know what to say. Steven stepped inside calmly, the same relaxed expression on his face as before. The manager hurried across the room with a wide smile. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to the Golden Crown." Steven looked at him for a moment. "I was here earlier." The manager blinked. "Oh, really?" Steven turned his head slightly toward Daniel. "Yes, your waiter already greeted me." The manager looked confused. Daniel suddenly felt the knot in his stomach tighten. "Daniel?" the manager asked. Daniel tried to speak, but the words felt stuck in his throat. Meanwhile, one of the executives standing beside Steven stepped forward. "Mr. Seagal, the meeting documents are ready whenever you are." The manager's smile slowly disappeared. "Mr. Seagal?" Another guest gasped. Did he just say Steven Seagal? Now the entire restaurant was staring. The same man who had been quietly turned away 15 minutes earlier was suddenly the center of attention. The manager quickly changed his tone.
"Oh my goodness, sir, we are honored to have you here." Stephen remained calm. No anger, no raised voice, but the silence surrounding him felt heavier than any argument. Daniel could feel every eye in the restaurant on him because everyone was starting to realize something. The man he had judged by his appearance was someone the entire world recognized, and the night inside the Golden Crown was only beginning to change.
The entire restaurant had gone quiet. Moments ago, the room had been filled with laughter and conversation. Now, every table seemed frozen in place. All eyes were on the man standing near the entrance, Steven Seagal. Daniel felt his chest tighten. His mind replayed the moment from 15 minutes earlier, the words he had said, the way he had refused the table. Suddenly, those few minutes felt much heavier than before. The manager quickly stepped forward, forcing an even bigger smile. "Mr. Seagal, it's an honor to have you here tonight. Please allow us to prepare the best table in the house for you." Steven looked around the restaurant calmly. "This is the same place I tried to have dinner earlier." The manager nodded quickly. "Yes, of course. There must have been some misunderstanding." Steven turned slightly and glanced at Daniel. He already explained things. The manager's smile faded just a little. "What exactly happened?" he asked quietly. Daniel tried to speak, but the words came out uneven. I thought the restaurant was full." A few guests nearby exchanged knowing looks, because everyone could clearly see the empty tables. One of the executives standing beside Steven stepped forward and opened the folder he was carrying. "Mr. Seagal, the ownership meeting documents are ready," he said. The manager blinked. "Ownership meeting?" The executive nodded calmly. "Yes, Mr. Seagal has been in discussions with the restaurant's parent company for the past 2 weeks." The manager's expression slowly changed from confusion to shock. "You mean—" "Yes," the executive continued calmly. "Mr. Seagal is considering becoming a major investor in this restaurant chain." A quiet gasp moved through the dining room. Several customers immediately pulled out their phones. Someone whispered loudly, "Wait, he might actually own this place soon." Daniel felt the blood drain from his face. 15 minutes earlier, he had refused to serve the very person who might soon control the future of the restaurant. The manager quickly cleared his throat and turned back to Steven. "Sir, please accept our apologies for earlier. We would be honored to host you tonight." Steven remained calm. Then he said something that made the room even quieter. "I didn't come back for an apology." The manager hesitated. "Then, may I ask why you returned?" Steven slowly looked around the restaurant. Guests sat silently, waiting to hear his answer. Finally, he spoke. "I came back because moments like this reveal something important about people." He turned slightly toward Daniel again. "How someone treats a stranger tells you everything about their character." Daniel lowered his eyes. The older waitress who had noticed Steven earlier stepped forward nervously. "Sir, if you would still like dinner, I'd be happy to serve you personally." Steven smiled gently. "Thank you." Then he looked at the manager. "But before we sit down and talk business, I think there's something everyone here should understand." The entire room waited. Even the pianist had stopped playing. Steven Seagal was about to turn a simple dinner into a moment none of them would ever forget. And what he said next would change the atmosphere of the entire restaurant. If you were in Steven's place, would you forgive the waiter or hold him accountable? Comment below, forgive or lessen. I'm curious what you would choose. The restaurant had fallen into complete silence. Steven Seagal slowly walked through the dining room, his presence commanding attention without a single raised voice. Guests stopped mid-conversation, waiters froze in their steps, and even the pianist let a note linger in the air longer than usual. He stopped a few feet in front of Daniel.
The young waiter's stomach twisted with nervousness. His hands were clammy, his knees weak. The reality of what had just happened and what could happen was sinking in. "Sir, I'm so sorry," Daniel stammered. "I didn't know who you were. I shouldn't have—" His words trailed off as he searched for an apology worthy of what he had done. Steven raised a hand gently, stopping him. His voice was calm, but carried weight that seemed to make the entire room lean in to listen. "That's exactly the problem," Steven said softly. "You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with respect." Daniel swallowed hard. He wanted to nod, to say something, but the words seemed trapped in his throat. Steven turned slightly toward the older waitress, the one who had spoken up earlier. "And you," he said warmly, "for staying courteous when others judged. Thank you." She blushed, feeling both proud and relieved. Then Steven's eyes met the manager's. Mr. Collins's confident smile had disappeared, replaced by panic and disbelief. "You see," Steven continued, "true power doesn't demand attention. True influence doesn't yell or boast. It simply exists, and it shows up when it's needed." Mr. Collins's jaw tightened. He tried to speak, to regain control, but the words wouldn't come. The room was listening. Every guest could feel the weight of Steven's words. Daniel finally found his voice. "Sir, I understand now." Steven nodded once. "Good. Learn this lesson. It's more valuable than any tip or promotion." Then he turned and walked toward a table near the window, the same table he had wanted 15 minutes ago. Guests gave him space, letting him move unchallenged. The older waitress discreetly followed behind him, ready to serve him personally. Daniel watched, realizing that this quiet man, someone he had judged in a split second, had just delivered a lesson that would stay with him for life. Steven picked up the menu, but it felt ceremonial rather than practical. He didn't need the food to remind anyone of who he was. His presence alone had already spoken volumes. He looked back once at Daniel. "Treat every guest as if they could change your world tomorrow, because sometimes they will." Daniel's eyes widened. The words sank deep, more impactful than anything the manager could have said in a lifetime. The manager, still pale and trembling, finally nodded. Yes, sir. Understood." Steven Seagal finished his meal quietly, not seeking attention or applause. There was no dramatic exit, no grand show of power. Just calm, deliberate presence that left a mark on everyone in the room. As he left, the staff remained silent, processing what had just happened. It wasn't just about fame or wealth. It was about humility, character, and respect. Lessons that couldn't be taught in training or memorized in a handbook. Daniel took a deep breath. He felt lighter, wiser, and determined to change how he treated people from now on. The older waitress smiled at him knowingly. "You'll remember this, won't you?" she whispered. "I will," he replied quietly. And just like that, a simple dinner had become an unforgettable lesson for an entire restaurant.
By the time Steven Seagal stood up to leave, the restaurant was completely silent. Every table, every waiter, every guest had been touched by the quiet but powerful lesson he had delivered. No words shouted, no anger, no dramatic confrontation, just presence, just calm authority. He walked slowly toward the exit, taking in the room one last time. Daniel followed with the older waitress, ready to assist if needed, but Steven waved them off gently. He didn't need help. He didn't need anyone to make a fuss. His impact had already been made. Before opening the door, he paused and turned to face the restaurant once more. His voice was soft but carried effortlessly across the room. "Respect isn't something you give only to the rich, the famous, or the powerful," he said. "It's something you give to everyone, especially when you think no one is watching."
Daniel's stomach tightened. Every word felt like a weight settling onto him. He realized that in just a few minutes he had learned more about life than he had in months of work. Humility, patience, respect. These weren't lessons written in a handbook. They were demonstrated in moments like this, in how a man chooses to respond when underestimated. Steven looked at Daniel one last time. Sometimes the person you underestimate today is the person who changes your future tomorrow. Remember that. Daniel nodded, swallowing hard, as a mix of relief and awe washed over him. He knew that nothing about that evening would ever be the same. The older waitress quietly approached the manager. "Sir, maybe it's time we rethink how we treat people here," she whispered. The manager, pale and shaken, nodded slowly. "Yes, I understand now. That was enlightening." Outside, the city lights glimmered, but inside the Golden Crown, the real glow was the lesson Steven had left behind. Patrons who had been skeptical or amused 15 minutes earlier were now whispering excitedly about what had just happened. Phones were out, capturing snapshots and videos, but the true memory was etched into every mind in the room. As Steven stepped out into the cool night air, he didn't look back. There was no need. His work here was done. True influence, he had proven, didn't need to show off. It didn't need recognition. It simply left a mark. Daniel, now back behind the counter, finally exhaled. He looked around at his coworkers. Their faces reflected the same realization. Appearances can be deceiving. First impressions can be wrong. And sometimes humility and respect speak louder than authority or money ever could. The older waitress leaned close and whispered, "You'll remember this moment forever, won't you?" Daniel nodded silently, feeling a mix of shame and gratitude. Shame for his quick judgment, gratitude for the lesson that would shape how he treated every single person from now on. The restaurant slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but something fundamental had changed. Conversations were quieter, movements slower, and every glance carried a newfound awareness of how each person in the room might be judged or misunderstood. That night, the Golden Crown had learned more than just how to serve its guests. It had learned about character, about respect, about humility. And all it took was a quiet, composed man who didn't need to prove his importance to anyone. As Steven disappeared into the night air, Daniel whispered under his breath, "I hope one day I can be that calm, that confident, that respectful." And just like that, a simple dinner had transformed into a lesson no one there would ever forget.
Which part of this story surprised you the most? Comment below and let me know. Your thoughts will help us make even better stories next time.